Spiritual Christianity, collected from the theological works of Emanuel Swedenborg. Paragraph 150. We are now, it is hoped, in a condition to understand that there is no intrinsic difference between the two sensuous worlds, both being equally created by the influx of the divine life in the sentient faculties of the mind. So far from the world of the naturalist having been created, as he imagined some 1,000 years ago, it is equally with the spiritual world, ever being created and being sustained in existence by him who is ever creating it. With these master truths before us, there will be no difficulty in understanding that the so-called spiritual and natural worlds are nothing else than two states of life, from the latter of which that man immediately and permanently passes, whose natural state is brought to its completion, or when he is prepared to enter upon another state, and that state either having one of heavenly happiness and delight, in consequence of his having, while in his first or natural state, put his trust in the Lord his God, by shunning evils because they were sins against him and injurious to his fellow creatures, or else one or other of the forms of wickedness which prevail in hell, in consequence of him having confirmed himself in the love of self, and so become his own God, or of his having lived and confirmed himself in the indulgence of his sensual passions. It is by means of these two opposite states of mind that their respective worlds are formed, in which the whole world, as well as every object, down to the minutest appreciable particular, is in the exactest correspondence with their collected as well as the individual states of mind. And though, in the pure blindness of our intellects, we may not be able to read the volume that is equally set before us, we may be assured that intrinsically the correspondencies are as real, though to us they may be unreal, as complete and perfect as they are in the spiritual world, being created by the same divine means and for the same divine ends. If we are prepared to admit thus far, it follows that the change called death, stripped of its unreal trappings, which cause it to be seen as if it were a separation of the soul from the body, is nothing more than a change in the state of the mind, and that new world of sensations, into the perception of which the emancipated being enters, is an effect consequent upon such interior change. This brings us to the next step in the path of spiritual truth. The distinction between the two worlds is not a distinction of space, but a discriminated difference between a spiritual mode of thinking and a natural. From Apocalypse Explained 5.2.7. Every man has both a lower or exterior mind and also a superior or interior mind. The former is his natural mind and is called the natural man, and the latter is his spiritual mind and is called his spiritual man. The words mind and man are used synonymously because man is a man from his mind. These two minds, superior and inferior, are entirely distinct from one another. By the lower mind he is in the natural world, but by his superior mind he is in the spiritual world, and with angels in that world. These two minds are so distinct that man, while he is living in the natural world, is unconscious of what is passing in his superior mind, and when he becomes a spirit, which he does immediately after death, he is then equally unconscious of what is passing in an inferior or natural mind. And from True Christian Religion 475. Man is not aware of his being as to his mind in the midst of spirits, because those spirits with whom he is associated in the spiritual world think spiritually and speak spiritually. But the spirit of man, so long as he remain in the material body, thinks and speaks naturally. But spiritual thought and speech can neither be understood nor perceived by the natural man, nor can the thought and speech of a natural man be perceived by the spiritual, and this is the cause why they are not mutually seen. And back to Tulk's commentary, paragraph 150. It is a fact worthy of notice as illustrative of this system of spiritual Christianity that throughout the theological works of the author, the words man and mind are used synonymously because, as he says in the above extract, man is a man, that is, a human being, from his mind, and he might have added, on no other ground. His very body and its senses with which in his natural ways of thinking his mind seems to be connected are nothing more, and he sees them to be nothing more when he has learnt, by casting off the fallacies of the natural and sensual thought, than representative effects, imaging correspondentially the original form of the individual mind in its adaptation to peculiar uses, as well as in its tendencies to peculiar kinds of evil. So do angels understand the bodily form, and such an explanation do they give it, and therefore to them it is a real form because they perceive it to be what it really is, a representative outbirth of the mind. Whereas to man, in his natural, and still more in his sensual conceptions, is not real, for he thinks of it as an aggregation of material atoms, curiously put together and connected in some incomprehensible manner with the mind. This conclusion, considering that he is dealing with two things, the powers of the mind and the aggregation of atoms, which being in his own view of it unalike in kind, can have no possible ratio or relation to one another, might be supposed to be going as far as the naturalist well could go. But there have been others found to descend still lower in the scale of thought, who have maintained that atoms of matter have an inherent power of arranging themselves after a certain fashion, and when arranged, of thinking and willing as an individual being. Paragraph 152. In the poverty of human language, the elements of whose words have all been taken from the conditions of space and time, considered apart from the mind, the spiritual mind is designated as superior and the natural mind as inferior, and yet they are not superior or inferior in the sense of higher or lower, any more than they are interior and exterior. The one is said to be superior and interior, and the other inferior and exterior in reference to their respective dignities and uses. Every man has potentially two such minds or forms of mind. The exercise of these two forms of mind brings him into two distinct spheres of thought, coincident with the thoughts either of spiritual or of natural beings. In consequence of the respective worlds of sensation being altogether determined by the will and thought, man is, by his lower or exterior mind, in his natural world, where all things correspond to and as effects represent the aggregate states of such lower or exterior minds. But spiritual beings, and the same is true of men also, to the extent that they can enter into the reality of things, are in the spiritual world, such spiritual world being an outbirth of those peculiarities which characterize spiritual thought. Paragraph 153. It is said that the thought and speech of the natural man can no more be perceived by the spiritual man than spiritual thought and speech can be understood or perceived by the natural man. And then it is added, as if to set the question for ever at rest, at least with those who will admit the rational force of interior truth, that this is the cause why spiritual and natural beings are not mutually seen. So clear is that the cause of their not being visible to one another is not because there is any distance of space between them which might be supported from the sensuous state of both being called worlds, but in their entirely different modes of thinking. space and time, and all that is comprehended by them, being, as we shall learn hereafter, in both states of life equally, the outbursts of the thought. In paragraph 152. In further confirmation of this heavenly principle, some account shall be given here of one of those memorable relations which are interspersed through the writings of this author, and which he describes as the opening of his spiritual sight, but the cause of which, as the reader may now clearly discern, lies deeper than the opening of any sentient faculty. It occurs in a work containing the greatest store of the most holy and attractive, as well as practical wisdom at this day extant in the world. In number 326 of his work upon married love, or conjugal love, he says that on one occasion when he was in the spirit, he approached a certain chief teacher who had the care of a gymnasium, and had been proposing to his pupils a problem for discussing concerning the soul. As he approached the teacher, he was accosted with the inquiry, "Who are you? I was surprised to find, as you were approaching, that at one moment you came into sight, and the next moment you were gone, or that one while I saw you, and suddenly I did not. Assuredly, you are not in the same state of life as we are." Swedenborg in reply tells him that he is at once both a native and a foreigner, alternating between their mental light and shade. When requested to explain this, he replied, "I am in the world in which you formerly were, and from which you have departed, and which is called the natural world, and I am also in the world into which you have entered, and where you are now, which is called the spiritual world. Hence it is that I am at once in a natural state and a spiritual state, and when I am in a natural state of thought, I am not seen by you, but I am seen when I am in a spiritual state." He then proceeds to give the subject of their conversation at considerable length, all bearing more or less upon the master truth that it is spiritual thought, when it springs from spiritual affection, which produces the external presence, and that in proportion as there is less of internal difficulty to overcome in the spheres of love and thought, the effect will be shown in the celerity with which the mutual presence responds to the thoughts and impulses of the mind. The same universal law can also be traced in the means which are suggested to the love, by thought, to remove, even in our natural state, the obstacles which belong to space and time, that they whose spheres of life accord may meet each other. Indeed, the very obstacles of space and time, as well as the natural means used to overcome them, are effects which correspond to and so represent the state of the natural man, who thinks in space and time, and is rarely able to so raise his mind as to think above them. And paragraph 155. Still further to corroborate the truth that these two so-called worlds are essentially two distinct states of thought, of which the sensuous phenomena are the respective outbursts, it may be mentioned here that whosoever a man is able to think of nature with the multitudinous relations of its objects, not as existing extraneous to himself, but as effects created by him who is the essential life of all that lives, through the intervention of the concurrent spheres of spiritual and natural thought, so soon as ever he thus thinks, he is straightway seen by spiritual beings, with whose thoughts his own have in this way become consonant, but that he no sooner thinks, even as he usually thinks, in space and time, that is, in the fallacies of natural thought, than he forthwith vanishes from their sight.